Welcome to the Liminauts podcast. Interviews with individuals testing the liminal spaces between disciplines, perspectives, and practices, with a focus on Buddhism, spirituality, science, philosophy, and wellness from a left perspective. I'm your host, Ben Hawes. My guest today is Curt Steinmetz, aka Zen Master Cheong. Curt is a Zen Master who received transmission from Zen Master Daegak at the Furnace Mountain Zen Center in Kentucky in 2020. He is based in Rockville, Maryland, and is responsible for starting 3 different Zen groups: the Indianapolis Zen Center, the All Being Zen Sangha in Washington, D.C., and Daido-sa in Rockville, Maryland, which is part of the Furnace Mountain Sangha. I'll be talking to Curt about being a DSA member and the role of activism within Zen practice and Buddhism in general, and whether Buddhism is a nonviolent religion. So without further ado, here's my interview with Curt. So, good morning. Thanks for doing this.
It's great to be here, Ben.
I've known you for at least we first met in basically total silence with a little bit of chatting in the beginning and the end back in '96, and when we were on our 90-day Kyolche retreat in Korea with Zen Master Daegak, Robert Ganthner. And it's almost 30 years later, and now you're a Zen Master. So, so what's it like being a Zen Master, Curt?
Yeah, it's okay. So there is a certain amount of responsibility that's involved with it, and but yeah, it's pretty much the same as not being a Zen Master, I have to say.
Well,
whatever so that's like, what's it like to not be a Zen Master? I could throw the question back to you, Ben, but
you already understand. So, so what's the criteria in the Furnace Mountain School? So we both of us have a lot of experience, or at least my main thing was the Quantum Zen School of Zen Master Seung-san, and that has its own kind of first you take precepts, then you become a Dharma teacher, which is basically you just you lead stuff in during basically day-to-day Zen stuff, and you can teach people meditation, but you aren't really like a teacher. It's not like a certification that you've attained anything. And then they have the Jita Popsanim, which or Jita Popsa, which is you've attained something, but you're not independent. You're still underneath the main teacher, and then you receive your permission to teach. So Jita Popsas, I guess, have Inca or transmission, and then it goes on. So how did it work with Zen Master Daegak?
Well, so with Zen Master Daegak, he's only given transmission to 3 people that I know of. Zen Master Senshin in Australia, Zen Master Muhan Shim at Furnace Mountain, and then myself. But so Zen Master Daegak's style is very much a spin-off, you could say, of Zen Master Seung-san. So that's kind of a starting point. And if anything, it's less formalized, less institutionalized, but still in the same spirit, I would say. And of course, there's nothing special about what Seung-san does or what Zen Master Daegak does. I mean, this is all part of the Zen tradition going back to Bodhidharma. And this whole transmission business has always been a little screwy, actually, because, people who've read a little bit of Zen history will be familiar with the fact that Bodhidharma actually gave transmission to at least four people, one of whom was a woman. but we only talk about one of them. And for the first 6 generations of Zen in China, there's only this main line of transmission that's even usually it's even mentioned.
Right.
And sometimes it's denied, right? Denied
Right.
out of ignorance, or more often just by omission. But sometimes it's said that there were only these 6, whereas in fact it was already branching off from the beginning. And so, there is an obligation that's felt, I think, from generation to generation to keep the traditions alive, and therefore teachers have a responsibility to designate people who are going to be responsible for that when they're gone, who should be looked to, who is responsible, who it's being handed off to, and I think there's little or nothing more to it than that. And in theory, it goes back to Shakyamuni Buddha. Shakyamuni Buddha in the Zen tradition, and only in the Zen tradition, is it said that Shakyamuni Buddha gave this transmission to Mahakasyapa. But it turns out that
Raising the flower and all that.
The inside joke story where no one else got it. But
isn't that kind of Zen in general, though, and kind of an inside joke that nobody else gets?
And there's a good sense to that and a not so good sense to that. But that's another, we can talk about that a little bit more. But I just want to say another thing about Mahakasyapa, that it turns out that it's generally recognized that Mahakasyapa was the head of the Sangha after Shakyamuni Buddha died. And it's actually, even outside of Zen, it's often recognized that the Buddha gave his robe to Mahakasyapa, which in Zen is very symbolic. And so Zen makes a bigger deal about this because Zen wants to trace our lineage back to Shakyamuni Buddha, which I think is appropriate and correct. But what am I trying to say? Oh, just that we do get a little weird about the whole transmission thing. In Pure Land Buddhism, they also have these great elders, sometimes referred to, in my opinion, mistakenly as patriarchs. I think it's much more accurate to translate that as ancestor, which is actually
in the Chinese, right?
That's right. I mean, yeah. And in Chinese Pure Land Buddhism, they also have ancestors, but in their lists of ancestors, it often turns out that there's hundreds of years separating the death of one ancestor and the birth of the next one. So it's obviously not this kind of mind to mind or direct one person to another. Sometimes it's called warm hand to warm hand transmission. And the Pure Land people just say, well, our ancestors are the people who understood and preserved and gave us this tradition. So it's very simple. They're the people that we look to. And so I think that should be the case in Zen as well. Whatever kind of rigmarole a person goes through, it's to give us people who are entrusted with keeping the tradition going. And in reality, everybody who practices Zen is who's keeping the tradition going. A teacher sitting there with nobody being taught is, well, there's stories about that. One of my favorite.
Isn't that that's just a hermit? That's just a hermit, right?
It could be a hermit, or it could be like the great master Dao Sheng, who was not a Zen teacher because he lived before Zen came to China, but he would teach the rocks and the trees. And he taught the rocks and the trees because he had been expelled from the Sangha and had been forbidden to teach, because he taught universal Buddha nature at a time when the hierarchy of the Buddhist church, as it was in China at the time, didn't accept the idea of universal Buddha nature. So they labeled him as a heretic and expelled him. And so he said, fine. And he went out into the forest and just taught the rocks and the trees about Buddha nature until the rest of the Buddhists changed their mind and realized that he had been right. And then he came back and went back to teaching humans again. So you could be like Dao Sheng, without any human students, but I don't claim to be able to communicate with rocks and trees. So I try to stick to humans.
I mean, do you think part of the emphasis on this mind-to-mind transmission is really goes, or either comes out of, or is a justification for some of the tendency of teachers to act in what could be seen as crazy ways outside of kind of what if you were more Theravadan standards of propriety, et cetera, like cutting off students' fingers and hitting them and that sort of thing. Traditionally,
shouting and hitting. Basically, what you're talking about is the whole shouting and hitting thing, and in my opinion,
because you want to make sure that the person who is shouting at you or hitting you is gotten something from the teacher, that they're just not taking it upon themselves to just indulge in their fantasies of sadomasochism.
Right, and so I think that there's a broader issue here, and that is practicing what you preach. I mean, so a teacher's teaching and their actions should be one. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I mean, and at the same time, I think that what a teacher teaches to others, so what that means really, if the teaching and the actions of the teacher are the same, then the teacher shouldn't be engaging in any activities that he isn't, or she isn't, or they aren't encouraging their students to engage in. So it shouldn't be do as I say, not as I do. I don't believe in that. Now, I think that these stories that people tell about people getting their fingers cut off, or teachers who are shouting and hitting, they're
important stories. They're koans,
but they are also. So Thich Nhat Hanh has a book about this, although he's not talking specifically. He's kind of by implication talking about it. But the book is called, I can't remember the exact title now, but it's The Correct Way to Get Hold of a Snake. And he says it's important to recognize the danger that there can be in Buddhist teaching, or any teaching, and that if you grab the snake the wrong way, then you're in big trouble. And so, it isn't just stories about shouting and hitting. Even teachings on compassion, if you grab it the wrong way, mm-hmm. Then you can get it all wrong. And so it's always important to be very careful. And so people should be, and if you should be careful with all teachings, then you should be especially careful with teachings that seem to be a little out of step with what we normally think of as mm-hmm. ethical or compassionate behavior. You should be especially careful with those. But I think, in fact, a lot of times people are less careful with those stories because they embrace the perceived recklessness or wildness of it, without really looking at the fact that there's always some very close relationship between the people who are involved in these stories, and without that relationship, then it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. Within the context of a very close, intimate relationship, that provides a context. And without that context, there's no general shouting and hitting by themselves, cutting people's fingers off by themselves, do not constitute some Zen sort of behavior.
Right.
In and of themselves, they constitute bad behavior, bad speech, bad actions, harmful speech, harmful actions, mm-hmm. Which should always be avoided. Of course, except for when, Zen Master Sung San taught, if your mind is very clear, then just go straight. And he taught us that when we did Kyolche together. He said, mm-hmm. During Kyolche, there are many, many rules. But what if the building is on fire? Should I maintain silence? He said, if your mind is very clear, just go straight. But when your mind is not clear, follow the precepts. So, any action that doesn't follow the precepts, should be avoided. And then, of course, unless the building is on fire, unless your mind is very clear, and I don't claim any great level of realization. I pretty much try to, um, act in a way that is, ethical in a fairly conventional sense. I,
Mhm.
I think that's what people should do, whether they're teachers or not.
And I mean, yeah.
A teacher should act in a way that everyone should act.
Mm.
If a teacher has anything to teach, it should be through how they live. Not that I hold my own life up as an example, but um, certainly, um, I think that's is the most important thing that a teacher can do, is to set an example.
Well, I think talking about this is good because I know certainly most people, when they get really into Zen, it's oftentimes this kind of outrageous stories that, especially, to
Hmm.
Westerners, or maybe it's mostly Americans, but,
Hmm.
um, the sort of rebelliousness, the non-sanctimoniousness,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
and I think that even more now, the sort of spectacular nature of that, and attaching to that spectacular nature, uh, if you think about, uh, social media and that sort of thing, I mean, that's, um, the spectacularness is how we form, um, our attachment. It's not like the everyday. I mean, the thing of like Kilche, like,
Hmm.
98% of it is just having a sore back and knees and feeling really sleepy, you know?
And
Uh,
wanting to get out.
yeah.
That was
Yeah.
a big deal for me. Yeah.
Mm. And, but, we go for that maybe like 2% where, something feels different than it did before, or, you feel, instead of feeling just uncomfortable all the time and tired all the time, you have some kind of contradictory or paradoxical feeling of, well,
Hmm.
actually everything is not only just fine, but
Hmm.
about as good as it could ever be.
Hmm.
And a feeling of not even non-attachment to that moment itself, which is kind of what makes it good. um, and I kind of think about sort of, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today was, just, um, we're Facebook friends, and I often see you posting from, things from like, from Jacobin, or from,
Yep.
the Instagram, Working People's History, I think it's called.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Hmm.
and so, it's in, Buddhism is very upper middle class,
Hmm.
in America. It seems to be, if it's not just boiled down into mindfulness as a technique to help you grind and be more productive, and or keep your cool while you're, trying to maximize returns on your time and investment in capitalist economy, um,
Hmm.
is, a pastime of people who have means, for the most part. There are exceptions,
Hmm.
especially in um, Pure Land, things like Soka Gakkai, and Nichiren Buddhism, where you tend to get a bit more diversity, at least in terms of not just either Asian or Asian Americans, or AAPI folks, or middle, upper middle class white folks, but you also get African Americans, and
Hmm.
I'm thinking of, say, Tina Turner.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so, but generally, it tends to be sort of this preoccupation of the middle class, and that goes along with sort of, very, um, milk toast kind of liberal sentiments, but people basically still believing in the system, and maybe they vote, and they give some
Hmm.
money, but um, you know Zen seems to be one way of coping, or Buddhism seems to be a way of coping with the world as it is. And the question is, should we be more involved in, with trying to change the world as it is, and that's like a leftist provocation, is that that's the way things are sending us towards doom, and so having a more revolutionary spirit and thinking about things in terms of upending our comfort collectively, those of us who are comfortable, and forming alliances with people who are not comfortable, would be the way to change things. And the discourse, though, on the left, if you're online at all, if you're on Twitter or listen to podcasts or whatever, tends to be very focused on the spectacular, and so I think it's kind of a we tend to focus on those things, but in terms of understanding how either your own transformation or transformation of society happens, it's a lot of little things in a practice of a lot of little things over and over and over again, without really any prospect for things to change. What's your perspective on where your Zen practice and where your politics meet, and how they inform each other? And what do you think of the state of what Zen and Buddhism are accomplishing for us? Like, why are we even doing this, I guess, is the question. Given everything that's going on, like, is this a good use of our time?
Well, I think that people should be involved in political or social activism, to the extent that that's a genuine concern or something that spontaneously, arises in them. Especially in the age of social media, people have a tremendous amount of exposure, if they're on social media at all, to a lot of one line or two line sloganeering and just kind of shouting out different political perspectives or social ideas or whatever. But actual activism is quite different from that. What I'm trying to say is that, I don't think, certainly not as a Zen teacher or just as a Zen student, that I'm interested in promoting a particular Zen or Buddhist approach to politics. In the first place, I think Buddhism is such a tiny minority of people in the West that the idea that we have any influence is pretty ridiculous. Every time I see an open letter from leading Buddhists about something, I think well, there's a waste of time. I mean, you want to talk about a waste of time. I mean, who cares?
Right.
Who cares what a tiny minority, religious minority, and also who are these people to claim to speak in the name of Buddhism or anything? People can speak for themselves, and I think that that's important for people to. It's vitally important for people to have things in their lives that they care deeply about, and if you care deeply about something, you need to pursue that. And I certainly think that a practice like Zen helps with that. A practice like Zen is good at concentrating and focusing our minds and forcing us to look at our lives. If you look at your life and you see how much of it is wasted, and then if you look into your heart and see what you care deeply about and see how little you do about it, then that's more important, that experience of seeing that clearly for yourself and not looking at someone else and judging them, but of seeing what it is, how we actually spend our time and energy, and what it is that really is meaningful to us, and seeing often the great disconnect between those two, and then finding what arises from that genuine experience is more important than I'm a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. Okay, so big deal. I don't I don't really participate in any of their activities, which mostly consists of calling people on the phone or going door to door and doing stuff that I'm not really that well.
I too am a paper member.
Yeah,
So,
I mean,
mea culpa, there's lots of us out there.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, one of the reasons why I finally joined was because, I thought it was cool that there were so many people in the United States who now self-identify as
Mm-hmm.
socialists and are even willing to go to that extent of at
Mm-hmm.
least joining, putting their name down as being a member, and which I think is a good thing, but I don't think that there is a Buddhist or a Zen answer to that. I mean, people, there's sometimes a little compartmentalization is not such a bad thing, because there are Buddhists who are conservative. Okay, there are Buddhists who are milquetoast liberals, like you just said. There are not that many Buddhists who are like um, uh, who want to see uh, I don't know, however you want to put it,
The
some sort
downfall
of
of
social,
capitalism.
the downfall of capitalism, the workers take power, whatever,
Yeah.
I mean,
The dictatorship of the proletariat. You don't
yeah,
really see
sure.
that
Right.
being posted,
Yeah. And,
on,
and so,
Zen forums.
but there is an important issue here that I'm not going to try to give a definitive answer to, but it's something that people really do need to look at, and that has been around for a long time. It's been an issue in the socialist movement, and it's also been a perennial issue among Buddhists, especially in modern times.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, what's the balance between working on ourselves and trying to change the society around us?
Right. Right.
And, Lenin, speaking of the dictatorship of the proletariat, on the eve of the October Revolution, there was a debate among socialists in Russia, many of whom said, your Russian society isn't ready for a socialist
Mm-hmm.
revolution. And Lenin, who was on the other side, said, we must make a revolution with people as they are now. Okay. That was his perspective. We don't, because there were those who said, no, we must educate and organize and raise the consciousness of the working classes and the peasantry so that they are ready to take power. And Lenin said, no, we must move forward with people as they are now. So, and that's just another way of saying, enough working on ourselves. Let's
Mm-hmm.
change things. And that didn't turn out very well. I mean,
Right. And, and,
I'm
and
not,
Marx, Marx said, it's like you can't go from a peasant
well, right.
economy straight into, turn it into communism, because you need to basically go through, capitalism first, and which allows for the industrial development and the mass education, all this sort of stuff that happens, and then that basically that creates the class consciousness and the infrastructure to eventually have people be doing less work. I mean, the idea is you're trying to get people out of suffering, right? It's whatever the vehicle that does that. That's what you want. And so there's a lot of looking back on that era, and what if they had basically said, okay, well, worldwide communism isn't going to happen. Germany's not stepping up to the plate. Their workers have decided to sell out and get a nice package for themselves, and they're not going to overthrow their government. So maybe we should just basically become soakdems now and have a market economy and try to make it compassionate, and then see what happens. And would that have been better for the world than trying to essentially create skip a step and all that?
Right. Yeah. But I think that whether people are left-wing socialist revolutionaries or mildly progressive whatever, or conservative, I think Zen has actually Zen Master Sung San taught this explicitly in one of his letters. He said, if Republicans practice Zen, then they will achieve correct republicanism. If communists practice Zen, they will achieve correct communism. And I like that quote. I'm not really sure what to make of it.
Yeah.
But
it's a very Zen Master Sung San quote. It's very
very zen-y. I think it sounds good because it's making the right point. Well, at least in my opinion, trying to come up with a a master program of. I mean, I have tremendous respect for Thich Nhat Hanh, but I think the whole idea of engaged Buddhism is not completely without worth, but at the same time, in the sense of starting specific organizations and getting involved in specific movements and making that be part of your Buddhist practice. So on an individual level is what I do already. I to whatever extent I feel comfortable and am capable, I engage in whatever kind of political or social activism that looks meaningful or accessible to me. But I don't then go out and tell others this is what we Buddhists should do, or this is what we Zen people should do, because I don't think there's much to be gained from that. And one thing that is gained from that is, first of all, you alienate people who perhaps aren't interested in politics at all.
Mm-hmm.
You can talk about people who are like conservative or MSNBC progressives or whatever, but at the same time, a lot of times you start talking about politics or start talking about organizations or movements or whatever, a lot of people just tune you out immediately.
Yeah.
And you could say, oh, but they shouldn't. Well, yeah, right, they shouldn't, but they do. and so you are. I think when you do that, you're digging yourself deeper into a hole that convert Buddhism in the West has already kind of dug itself into. A convert Buddhism, as opposed to all of the Vietnamese and Chinese and Korean and Southeast Asian people in the United States who were born and raised Buddhists because they're from a Buddhist culture and living in immigrant communities in the United States. Many of them are extremely conservative. The Vietnamese Buddhists in the United States tend to be extraordinarily conservative. There's the Falun Gong Chinese, which is some people would question whether or not Falun Gong is Buddhist or not. I think it is. I think it's Buddhist in the very proud tradition of weird syncretic Chinese Buddhism, which I love weird syncretic Chinese Buddhism. I think it's great. But I think a lot of things about Falun Gong are very interesting, but they support Trump,
Right. And I think anti-communism too really has influenced Buddhists in America too, but just because of, persecution of Tibetan Buddhism and there's a tendency on, for internet left, that's kind of tanky internet communism to, to basically follow, the Chinese party line and say, nothing that, the Tibetan Buddhists were just landlords who chopped off peasants' hands and, good riddance. And, what's wrong with, the Chinese Communist Party, appointing their own Dalai Lama or their own teachers. It's all, the same anyway, but I mean, and that's just to say that anti-communism comes out of, persecution of Buddhists in, communist countries. That certainly has happened.
Yes, right.
And so, it's kind of interesting that that's what goes together. And I think it's not just the immigrant communities of Buddhists where that happens, but I think it's been sort of absorbed into mainstream Buddhism. So you see, the farthest left, the left tendency, if people do have left tendencies, it's not just, kind of, sort of bland progressivism. If somebody labels himself as something, they're going to generally be an anarchist. And I'm thinking of one teacher, Ken MacLeod, who's a Vajrayana teacher, and he
does he call himself an anarchist?
He says he's an anarchist because communism, the whole idea of moving towards communism is that it requires the changing of human nature, and he doesn't believe that can happen, and so he calls himself an anarchist.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, well, Ken MacLeod, he's great, but I think
is this the Ken MacLeod who's editor of Shambhala, or is he the translator? I
think he's translated a lot, but I mean he has he's an important teacher. He's come out with a few books. He has a new one that's just come out.
Yeah, I'm probably getting it mixed up with someone else. But that raises another ideological issue that is, in my opinion, problematic for Buddhists, and that is that Marxism emphasizes the 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 unreconcilable conflict between the workers and the bourgeoisie,
Mm-hmm.
and that workers must develop a class consciousness that is intrinsically opposed to one section of society. So on the one hand, there's this appeal to solidarity. On the other hand, there's this appeal to see yourself in conflict with others. And so the solidarity aspect of that is wonderful. I mean, and
Right.
it's a tremendous teaching that socialists have always had for the working class, that, if you act by yourselves, you are screwed. If you join together, and if you find common interest with your fellow workers, then you can achieve anything.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is when you then go to the next step and says, so therefore line the bourgeoisie up and shoot them, or whatever. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's not an exaggeration in a historical sense. That's not an exaggeration at all. I mean, that's what actually often happens. But um, uh,
Though
uh,
Marx, I mean,
yeah,
Marx, doesn't. I mean, Marx doesn't tend to get violent in his writings. I mean, but certainly Lenin took that, and
yeah.
Mao
Well,
took that, and made that explicit.
mhm. But even if you take the violence aspect out of it, still the idea that the consciousness that people need to raise is based upon both finding a commonality with your fellow workers, but also based upon uh, seeing that your interests are irreconcilably opposed to the interests of another section of society, which in a which from a Buddhist perspective fundamentally is wrong. From an economic perspective, from a political perspective, there is if you want to get into Buddhist philosophy, there's in relative terms, there's a certain amount of truth to it. In absolute
Mm-hmm.
terms, it's absolutely wrong to see one group of society as having different. We all have the same interests, and we all have the same Buddha nature. Um, and I think that the encouraging of class hostility is problematic from a
Mm-hmm.
Buddhist perspective,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very deeply ingrained in the socialist movement, and for the socialists who are the most committed and probably have anyway, I mean, for the kind of socialists that I generally hang out with, they're the most likely to be suspicious of anybody who questions that dichotomy,
Mm-hmm.
because the questioning of that dichotomy is often in the kind of terms that you were referring to earlier, where the revolution isn't going to happen, so we should just work for reforms within the existing system, without trying to overthrow it. Uh, you know, anyway, but
Well, I just to be, I mean,
uh
devil's advocate, I guess,
yeah, yeah,
is say of the situation, it's like you're an extreme situation. You're a slave, right? You're somebody's property,
yes,
and you run away. You're
mhm.
stealing from your master.
Oh, yeah,
And I mean, that's that you're breaking a precept right there. So
hmm,
um,
yeah.
and
So I,
your interests are definitely in
mhm,
opposition, and
mhm,
you're going to cause them suffering. Loss of productivity, loss of money, uh, all these things, and you're destroying their property. So you're
mhm,
sabotaging their property.
yeah,
So it's kind of like in that sense, you can sort of see where where there is an inherent conflict,
mhm,
um, and and where the need to perpetuate power will just kind of feeds on itself. Is there a sense in which um, you're never going to change someone's mind if their money depends on their mind never changing.
yeah.
It's like the
Mhm.
To paraphrase
Oh,
Upton Sinclair, you can never convince a man of something that is he's paid to never understand.
right. Well, so I think that even though in the absolute sense, I think that a slave uh, should understand, slaves should understand that ultimately, in the absolute sense, that their interests and the interests of the slaveholders are the same because they all have Buddha nature. I also think that
Mhm.
anyone who's a slaveholder should never sleep easily at night, um, uh, because for fear of what their slaves are going to do. I mean, and that's always been the case. One of the most important things that many people don't know about American history um, is the fact that slaveholders, American slaveholders, did sleep in fear at night. Slave uprisings were a regular occurrence throughout the history of slavery,
Mhm.
in the Western Hemisphere, and I think that's a good thing,
Mhm.
up to and including slaves, killing their owners in the middle of the night as they slept, which is what they were afraid of. Um, I mean, I think that's appropriate action for a slave. Um,
Mm.
I don't think, and is
As a form of self-defense, essentially.
well, and yeah. So I, I think that one thing that I think saddles Western Buddhism a bit is the idea that Buddhism is supposed to be pacifistic.
Mhm.
In the Korean
Yeah.
tradition, um, when the Japanese invaded Korea in 1592, the Korean Buddhists fought fiercely against the Japanese invasion. It was very brutal, very bloody, and ultimately failed attempt to conquer Korea by the Japanese. But the Zen Master Sosan Taisa, whom every Zen master in the Korean tradition down to this day traces their lineage back to Sosan Taisa. There's no evidence that he had any qualms about uh, uh, fighting arms in hand against the Japanese invaders. In fact, he
Mhm.
organized an army of, usually it's referred to as an army of Buddhist monks.
Mhm. And this
I
and
don't
this
know.
was when?
Oh, this was in 1592.
Okay, yeah. So I was going to ask you about
Mhm.
that. So that's, basically, he organized armies of monks
Yeah,
to fight.
yeah, yeah, and there's no evidence that he had any, um, you know, uh, hesitation about doing that. There's no
Mhm.
evidence that he thought, "Oh, I don't know if I should do this or not." That he had some sort of,
There was
great
no hand
moral
wringing.
no hand wringing, no hand wringing. Quite the opposite. He just went straight. Zen Master Sung San served in the army during the Korean War. Um, and again, I don't think there was much in the way of hand wringing. And if we look at the way the Korean War worked out, um, he and all the other Buddhist monks in Korea were absolutely right to fight against the North Koreans. Um, not, I mean, from a Buddhist standpoint, they were absolutely right because Buddhism and Buddhists didn't fare very well in the North. But it's not just that. I mean, nobody fared very well in the North. It's a terrible. I mean, it's exactly the kind of situation that when North Korea, things like North Korea and Cambodia under Pol Pot, are good examples of why sometimes you don't want to make a revolution with people as they are now,
Mhm.
because I mean it's pretty easy to see how people as they are now would end up doing the kind of things um, that have happened in North Korea and that happened in Cambodia under Pol Pot. More emphasis on self cultivation would have been a good idea in both of those cases. Um, but those are historical realities, and to say what should have been done or could have been done in those situations, to make things turn out differently, is wildly speculative. I'm only mentioning it because I think that Zen Master Sung San was absolutely right and perfectly justified um, in participating in that war, and so Santesa was as well. Um, one of the most important figures in the history of the modernizing movement in Chinese Buddhism. Oops, what was that? Did you hear that, or was that just on my end?
No, I'm on your end, I think.
Okay, it's probably just some stupid Facebook notification. Um, anyway, oh yeah. So one of the most important figures in the history of the modernizing movement in modern Chinese Buddhism, in fact, is a guy named Taixu, Taixu, um, who why am I talking about him? Oh yeah, so he was a great early in his life. He was a big fan of Kropotkin. You were talking about anarchists before.
Yes.
The anarchists were big in East Asia back in the late mid 1800s, and in fact, Kropotkin's writings were much more popular than Karl Marx's writings, um, and Taishu ran a Buddhist newspaper that was heavily leftist, and they would run translations of articles by Peter Kropotkin on anarchism, including articles on political assassination. So there's little or no evidence that those modernizing Buddhist leftists were. I mean, it wasn't that they were bloodthirsty, but if you were, yeah, I mean, they were interested in social and political change in China, and they didn't have much faith in anything like sit-ins doing the trick. Anyway,
so two questions. One, do you think the early influence of anarchism had anything to do with the sort of Taoist background of East Asian, or especially Chinese Buddhism and Zen in particular? And then I'd love to have you just talk a little bit more about the relationship between precepts of not taking life, and then what could be considered acts of self-defense to prevent more suffering, and what do you see the danger there, right, for Buddhists, or the conundrum, even as a sincere practitioner, someone who's practicing, because certainly Buddhism is, by all intents and purposes, is seen as a pacifist religion in the West. Self-immolation is sort of like the most revolutionary thing you can do, as opposed to actually fighting and protesting. It's like that's our model, sort of, is Thich Quang Duc, who set himself on fire. It's like, okay, and it's very inspiring. I mean, certainly inspired me. But so yeah.
Yeah. So God, I was just yesterday somehow. Oh yeah, that's right. It's because I'm reading the Lotus Sutra. That's right. So I'm reading Lotus Sutra, and a group of us in the Rockville Zen group are actually reading through the Lotus Sutra slowly and studying it. We're not quite
very slowly.
Yeah, we're not quite there yet, but we are getting to the chapter on self-immolation. There's all kinds of weird stuff in the Lotus Sutra, and just when you think it can't get any weirder, there's someone who pours fragrant oil all over himself and then sets himself on fire. But having said that, I'm not going to say anything else about that. But I think that there's little or no evidence of that throughout the history of Buddhism prior to Westerners adopting Buddhism as a kind of a pet religion to some extent in the 60s and the 70s. There's no evidence of what we think of as pacifism as being ever considered to be a major part of Buddhist teaching or Buddhist practice. People use the word pacifism in all kinds of different ways. I recently saw somebody referring to Pete Seeger as a pacifist. Pete Seeger's great hero was Woody Guthrie, and Woody Guthrie wrote a love song to a Soviet sniper. And Woody Guthrie wrote on his guitar, "This machine kills fascists."
Right. Right.
So, there is a bit of a, I think, a naive and overly simplistic view of pacifism.
Right.
You know, I
I
mean,
mean, Martin Luther King owned a shotgun for self-defense,
yeah. Well,
and just came out that a lot of the critique of Malcolm X by Martin Luther King was completely fabricated. Like the transcripts, actually, the recordings came out, or the
mhm,
transcripts came out, and a lot of things he said, didn't happen. So there's obviously a reason
mhm,
for um, pacifism to be kind of promoted um, as a kind of feel good ideology
mhm.
for certain strata of, I guess, um,
Well, for people who will be okay
yeah,
either way.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
for
yeah.
people who don't
That's
have
the best
as
way to put it. Yeah,
people who don't have as much skin in the fight.
right, right.
And a lot of people would push back on that, but if the American pacifist movement, the real hardcore, honest to goodness pacifists, they opposed U.S. entry into World War II. They didn't want to fight against the fucking Nazis. Okay,
Hmm.
and you got to draw the line somewhere, and I draw it well before getting to that point, personally.
So, if you take precepts,
Yeah. Hmm.
one of the precepts is to, not
Right.
take life.
Yes.
So what do you think about that?
Well, no, I mean, I think you shouldn't take life. I mean, and I think that if you do, I mean, if you're ever in a situation where you have to defend yourself, or if you're ever in a situation where your country is invaded, or if you're ever in a situation where the Third Reich has arisen and is taking over the world, you know, and you make a decision that you do have to engage in warfare, or resistance, or I mean, and it isn't just a question of what should Americans have done during World War II. What about people who lived in Europe, who lived under Nazi occupation? um, I think that those who uh, you know blew up railroad lines and assassinated SS officers were, to a great extent, doing the right thing.
Hmm.
And if you actually look into the whole history of that, you'll find that they were often fighting very violently among themselves as well, because you had communists and you had, agents of the British Empire, working sometimes side by side in the resistance, and they were uh, uh, very much looking ahead to what would happen in Europe after the Nazis were run out. The communists wanted Europe to be, communist, and
Hmm.
the people who were working with the OSS and the Special Operations Agency, or whatever, SOA or SOE. I think they were both in Europe from the British. They did not want, so they were fighting anyway. So, but I think whether they were communists or people working with the OSS or the SOA, that the people who were, engaging in armed resistance against the Nazis in Europe, I think not only did they have every right to do so, but that they were doing the right thing.
Hmm.
Um, but and so people say, how do you square that with the precept to not kill? Well, and so one one answer to that is that people have always recognized that throughout the history of Buddhism, that the precept to not kill is not uh, well, that killing always entails karma. If you kill, no matter what your reasons are, there is karma involved. There is the karma of killing.
Yeah,
Um, but if you don't kill, your lack of action also has karma.
right. So in a sense, it's kind of like you are accepting the karma of uh, going to hell, so to speak, and then doing your best there to help people
That's
as
right.
well.
And if you sit by and refrain from resistance, and then other people resist and succeed in freeing your country from Nazi occupation, I mean, it's like, um, in the most extreme kind of sense,
Hmm.
um, then you're benefiting from their actions,
Hmm.
uh, without helping them. And other people find, people find ways. People, American conscientious objectors and other conscientious conscientious objectors often found ways of helping or participating, without directly participating in actual killing. I think sometimes that kind of behavior, um, uh, it just amounts to squeamishness, really, rather than anything that's really actually moral or ethical. You just don't want to see the blood yourself or have the blood on your own hands. But it's like people who, like, I'm not a vegetarian, but you know, uh, sometimes people interpret the precept to not kill, meaning that, or actually not just the precept to not kill, but also uh, the uh, the right livelihood teaching of Buddhism, to mean that Buddhists shouldn't be, that it's incorrect for Buddhists ever to be butchers. Now you can go to the Muslim butcher or whoever the butcher is, and get your
famously the Tibetans had
yeah
Muslim
yeah
butchers.
yeah. Um, and also, just as famously, Tibetans, Buddhists, as a general rule, up to and including the Dalai Lama and most monks and teachers of Tibetan Buddhism, are not vegetarians.
Right.
The Dalai Lama's older brother, who actually knew a little bit and had the opportunity to meet and know and work with a little bit in the Tibetan independence movement. The Dalai Lama's older brother he was also not a pacifist, and he didn't believe in this, negotiating with the Chinese stuff. He wanted to, and he worked with the CIA as well. He worked with the CIA to organize armed resistance against the Chinese, and which didn't work, as we all know now in history. He ended up in Bloomington, Indiana, and started the Tibetan Cultural Center in Bloomington, and was very influential in encouraging not just the study of Tibetan culture, but the study of Tibetan languages at Indiana University. Anyway, but he also started a restaurant in Bloomington, one of the first, maybe the first Tibetan restaurants in the Western Hemisphere. And it was not a vegetarian menu. It was a traditional Tibetan menu. And so not only was the menu not vegetarian, but when you go into the restaurant, I've been there a couple times, there's a picture of Norbu Rinpoche, that's his name, standing next to and shaking hands with Steven Seagal.
Right.
So I just, which I think is simultaneously horrifying and simultaneously horrifying, very educational, and three, important. People who have a very, California Soto, whatever. I hate to beat up on California Soto people. Some of my best friends are
California Soto people.
Are Soto Zen Buddhists. In fact, I actually helped to start a Soto Zen group that is affiliated with the San Francisco Zen Center in Washington, D.C. I'm a founding member of that group. That's another story. But and I love Dogen. I love the writings and teachings of Dogen. As far as I know, there's no evidence that Dogen was a pacifist. But people who have limited their understanding and exposure to Zen to either, what people in the San Francisco Zen Center or whatever, think, or possibly worse yet, what Buddhists who are in the Green Party think about Buddhism. Some of my best friends are in the Green Party. Some of my best friends are Republicans too, so I get around. But
I think all my friends who used to be in the Green Party are now in DSA.
Yeah, as they should probably.
Yeah.
But my only point is that the sooner people come into contact with the fact that limited idea of that Buddhists are all vegetarian pacifists who used to be in the Green Party and are now in DSA, um, that's not true. Um, that there's all kinds of Buddhists in the world and always have been. And that's the way it should be. We are, only unenlightened people need the Dharma. Um, and other people's unenlightenment often we find much more offensive than our own unenlightenment. And so someone else's unenlightenment manifests as being a Republican. Okay. But that doesn't mean that they're less enlightened than I am. We're all pretty much on the same level, I think. And those who actually are on a higher level, they don't mind me saying so because they've gotten beyond being offended at people not recognizing their higher level of attainment.
But do you think? I mean, so the Bodhisattva path to save all sentient beings of suffering. I mean, just to kind of go back a little bit more to the beginning of what we talked about in terms of not everybody should be an activist.
Oh, okay.
Not everybody should be an activist, right? But on the other hand, though, Sung San always talked about together action, right, as very important. Yes. The sack of potatoes that you can either wash them all individually or you can put them into a big bucket and agitate it with a big paddle, and then they all wash each other. And so we rubbing up against each other, we all become cleaner because we come up against ourselves, really, and against our own attachments and hangups, and we see the humanity in other people through understanding that we all have these hangups and these these karmically based opinions that we're all made of certain material stuff and are born to certain parents at a certain time in a certain society and know certain things and have certain brain chemistries, et cetera. And so, whatever we are, we don't have any control over, to the extent that we come into our awareness of ourself dependent on all these things that made us up until that point. But then, working with other people is how this, changes. But more than ever, we are all sort of individual monads working on ourselves. And at most, maybe we see each other 30 minutes to an hour a day, right? On a in person or the way that we do it on Zoom. Very few people live in Zen centers. Monasticism is more or less dying in the West. And so, what do you think together action would be now? If it's not activism, and we're not, seems like that the ways in which we would be together and rubbing up against each other are dying out. What do you think? Where do you think this together action could come from, or what would it look like? In your opinion? And not, I guess in Buddhism in general is very big, but say just even Zen.
Yeah. Well, so I think going back to the time of the Buddha, I mean, lay people have always been a huge part of the phenomenon that we call Buddhism. Okay, and there is often too much emphasis placed upon the monastic aspects of Buddhism. So a lot of your question was kind of couched in those terms of like, what kind of, because what Zen Master Sung San was proposing was kind of a soft core monasticism. He didn't
is a hybrid.
Right. He didn't want people, or he didn't try to, he did want people to become monks and nuns, and he did talk people into that. But he recognized that was, he would have, there was only so many people he could talk into doing that. So he talked people into coming and living at these Zen centers and living in kind of a semi-monastic existence. And that was a lot easier when the people that he was, bringing into the fold were in their 20s and 30s and early 40s. It gets harder and harder.
Once you have kids, for example.
Once you have kids, once you, anyway, you can't get people who are in their 40s and the 50s and 60s to just do that as easily. And
same thing goes for activism too, right?
Oh,
you go to a DSA meeting and everybody's a child, basically. You know?
well, yeah. I mean, I've actually never been to a physical DSA meeting.
Okay.
I've been to some online classes. I actually, finally in my old age, I finally read the first 15 chapters of Capital.
Uh-huh.
Thanks to a an online discussion group that the local DSA ran,
Mm.
and yes, and
Mm.
they were all. I mean, I was thrilled, and at the same time, kind of surprised at how young these people were. That I was finally reading Das Kapital with, but. What am I saying? What I'm saying is that this has always been a problem. This is not some modern thing that we're trying to figure out now. Buddhism has always included people who would, maybe come together uh, every now and then to go to ceremonies or do practice or whatever, and then go home. Which is what you're talking about, Then after practice is over, after ceremony is over, you leave the temple, you leave the meditation center, and you go home.
Right. Right.
And so that's always been the case. And the Buddha
Mhm.
Dharma has always been for those people. They've always played a huge role. And when we read books about Buddhism, when we read sutras, these are being translated by people. A lot of times they were monks, not always, but they they were scholars, and so they lived the life of a scholar, as much as that of a monk, which is a lot of time working on their own, sitting down and writing and reading, um, spending much of their time doing that, and the time that they weren't doing that, they were teaching classes or in classes. They were students and scholars, and that is not a lifestyle that seems so alien um, to us, and that's always been a huge part of Buddhism. Lay people, teachers, scholars, and people who just and even people who live in monasteries. Um, it's surprising how uh, little difference there is between a monastic community and any other community. Monastic communities have their hierarchies, they have their
Mhm.
neighborhood associations, they have their rivalries, they have their and in truth they have their friendships, their love affairs, all of human existence, it turns out, expresses itself. And I mean, in many monasteries, had their own police forces, their own armed groups. The Tibetan monasteries were famous for this back in the day. If one monastery has its own army, all the other monasteries had better have their own army too, or else they're in trouble.
Right. Right.
So, um, speaking of pacifism, yeah, that the pacifism has never ever been a part of Tibetan Buddhism, even nothing close to it. Um, uh, I didn't mean to bring that back up again, but
I mean, because but also, Chinese Zen. I mean, there were warring temples, right? People were, you know,
oh yeah,
people got physical over who had the transmission and
yeah,
who was authorized and who had the correct doctrine,
oh
right?
sure. Well, when Huineng, when not when the fifth ancestor,
Hmm.
what's his name? Geez, now I can't remember his name. But when he gave uh, transmission to Huineng in the middle of the night, he gave Huineng the robe and the bowl of Bodhidharma, and then he said, "Now run, because the other monks will kill you when they find out," because they didn't approve of him becoming the sixth ancestor. They had their own ideas about who that should be. Um, yeah, so I think this is another example of walking into a Tibetan restaurant and seeing that the menu is not vegetarian, and there's a picture of Steven Seagal on the
Right.
wall.
I
That
guess. Yeah.
Buddhism isn't what we think it is. Or
Yeah. Though I guess it's like feature or a bug, right? I guess is
oh
the
yeah,
question,
well
right?
it, it
The fact that Huineng had to run
mhm.
is that feature or a bug, right? Is
So
that because there was incorrect Zen being practiced,
mhm,
or
mhm.
is that that's just human nature,
Yeah.
or does that point to that there's a place for
Right.
slaughtering the
Hmm. Yeah.
people who are promoting the wrong idea,
Yeah.
in your opinion, about what true Zen should be?
So the feature aspect of it is that in all likelihood that story isn't true.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and the second feature aspect of it, feature not a bug, is that is the kind of story people like. That is the kind of story that gets retold because it's
Mhm.
interesting, because it gets
Right.
people's attention. If you say, oh, and then he gave so and so gave so and so, the robe and bowl of Bodhidharma, and everybody lived happily ever after, that's boring.
Right.
If you
Again,
say,
going back to the spectacular, that's
yeah,
the stuff with it. That's
right,
that's the stuff we
well,
want. We want drama.
and the Buddha called that, skillful means. And he said it was necessary in the Lotus Sutra, going back to the Lotus Sutra. Fire is an important theme in the Lotus Sutra, not just setting oneself on fire, but the burning house, which, so the image of samsara as a burning house doesn't originate with the Lotus Sutra. It originates in the earliest teachings of early Buddhism. But, the Buddha said not only is samsara a burning house, but, my children, which is us, are too stupid to see that the house is on fire, and the only way to tempt them out is to offer them goodies, like Zen. Zen is a goodie. Zen is something interesting. Zen is a shiny object, to get us to leave the house. But Zen is not just a shiny object. It's not a lie, because when in the story in the Lotus Sutra, when his children, the children of the father whose children were inside of a burning house and wouldn't leave, just because they were told that the house was on fire, they had to be offered goodies in order to leave. When they got out of the house, they were given those goodies. So Zen is not just a shiny object. It's not a
It's not deception.
it's not deception. It's there. It is there. If you leave the burning house, you do get your chariot, you do get your ox cart, or whatever is the thing that's been offered to you. It is there. Zen is a very real, live, and vibrant tradition. But then, just as Tibetan Buddhism is, and Theravada, and Pure Land, and these other wonderful traditions that are that do help us to take that first step outside of the burning house. But in other parts of the Lotus Sutra, and in many other teachings, it's you have to go beyond, just getting your ox cart. If you stop there, then that's not much better than being in the burning house. And so if you are attached to your image of what you think Buddhism is or what Zen is, then you're stuck at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And you might,
right, as lifestyle, which is, that's that there's a tendency, I think, now for all things, all practices to become essentially lifestyle, right? Because we live in a kind of culture of the society of the spectacle on social media, that sort of thing. So your activism is becomes merch, right? Becomes like t-shirt and and your in presentation and identity, and
yeah.
And so
Literally,
Buddhism as an identity is a very strong tendency among Buddhists, right?
Well, I think
as
I think
well,
it
but
is.
I mean, at least there's this reflexive, idea that, obviously, I mean, that's wrong, but still, I want to, I want all the trappings to help me keep believing it, and I guess that's, to a certain extent, it's skillful means, but to a certain extent too, it just becomes, ornamentation, right, of ego.
Right. Well, and also I think it's important to to kind of have as an asterisk next to that kind of Buddhism is often the people who are seen as engaging in that kind of Buddhism are actually often have a much deeper practice than that. That's what we see, and those people, like me, like you, are not fully enlightened Buddhas. and therefore their manifestation of the Dharma is going to be partial. Their understanding of the Dharma is going to be partial. But what's most important is my own. What's important to me to look at and to examine is my own practice, not someone else's. And so, if other people want to be, lifestyle Buddhists or appear to me to be that, I can't put much of my energy into that. And if other people want to be, California Soto Buddhists, in a way that I don't approve of, what difference does that make? And in reality, when I know the people that I do know who are like that, they are my friends. They are my Dharma brothers and sisters. And I love the fact that they are engaged in the Dharma, and I think they're doing the best that they can.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that they realize that I'm doing the best that I can as well.
I mean, do you think that Zen practitioners or Buddhist practitioners have an obligation to more of an obligation to self-sacrifice? Because I think part of the sort of Buddhism as identity temptation is that, well, I'm doing my practice, and then I'm showing off that I do my practice, and hopefully people will say, oh yeah, that looks cool, I want to do that, and you're going to change the world by making more Buddhists, right? But do you think that actually making more Buddhists, there's 100 years ago, you could probably count the number of non-Asian or non-immigrant Buddhists, you probably put them into a pretty small spreadsheet. But now Buddhism is spread everywhere, and does it as it stands? Has it made the world any better? Do you think? And or is there something more that's necessary to get back to together action, or the sort of comfortable nature of Western Buddhism?
Yeah. Well, so I think one thing that is somewhat related to what you just asked me is I think Western Buddhists should be we should work on our relationship with non-Western Buddhists and non-Western Buddhism. And one way of doing that is by becoming more aware of the things that non-Western Buddhists, Asian Buddhists, have been doing for the last 200 years in terms of their encounter with the West, their encounter with imperialism, their encounters with capitalism, their encounters with Western science, and what's been going on with that. And also their encounters with the whole idea of modernization and what the relationship between lay people and monastics should be, what the role of women should be. Asian Buddhists have been looking at this for a long time. People like Taishu and others. This is not something that we are just now figuring out. This is not something that Western Buddhists have to teach or to give to. And in fact, some people, and one of them is David Loy, a name that you're probably familiar with. You know David Loy at all, Ben?
Actually, not so much. I mean, I've heard the name.
Yeah, right. But David Loy has even gone so far as to say that Western Buddhists have to bring the idea of social justice to Buddhism, because that's been missing because that is missing from Asian society, he says, which is totally wrong. I mean, actually, the history of China has been the history of one peasant uprising after another. People in Asian society have always recognized not only that there is injustice in society, but that it can be changed. That the injustice comes from human beings and can be changed by human beings, and people have tried to change it. They've had about as much success as we have in the West in trying to change and making society more just. But I think there has to be a more of an active engagement with what some people refer to as actual Buddhism, which is the Buddhism that has been practiced for the last 2,500 years,
right,
by the people who have been practicing it, by the people who made it possible for us Westerners to even have access to such a thing as Buddhism in the first place. We need to learn a lot more about what they've been doing, what they've been thinking, and about the Buddhism that they have practiced, and the Buddhism that they made available to us, rather than having our own often baseless ideas about what we think Buddhism is and should be. And I think that would go a long way. I mean, so I think that one of the things we should do is to, if you want to have an engaged Buddhism, then, but you better make sure that it's actually Buddhism that is getting engaged, and not just your ideas. To learn more about the Dharma, and to learn more about, and then also, and I do not want to propose any sort of grand scheme for how this should be done, but there needs to be somehow a better communication in the West between convert Buddhists and immigrant Buddhists or ethnic Buddhists, for lack of a better term. People who are more often than not former Green Party members who are now in the DSA, not vegetarian pacifists, although actually they're very likely to be vegetarians. Vegetarianism is actually a very big deal in Chinese Buddhism. There's a wonderful vegetarian restaurant in Rockville, near where I live, that is run by wonderful Buddhists. You can tell they're Buddhists because they have all the Buddha statues in there. I mean, all Chinese Buddhists, all Chinese restaurants, at least should be filled with gaudy red banners and gold Buddha statues. If they're not, then it's not a real Chinese restaurant, in my opinion. Right. But but this one is just like, but it's also a vegetarian restaurant, and it's wonderful. And so for even though I'm not a vegetarian, when I look at the way in which Chinese Buddhists and East Asian Buddhists generally have looked at the issue of engaged Buddhism, one of the things that has been a very strong theme for many hundreds of years, going back more than, well before people like Tai Shu, being vegetarian and not just going further than just being vegetarian, going to the market and buying up all the animals that are waiting to be slaughtered and releasing them. That's been a big deal in Chinese Buddhism. I'm not anyway, but but what I'm really saying, what I really wanted to focus on is just, I'm not proposing, a series of dialogues or open letters or get-togethers or whatever, but just we need to be more open-minded and have a more humble attitude towards our fellow Buddhists here in the West, who are from, whether it's Cambodian or Thai or Chinese or Vietnamese or Korean or Japanese or whatever traditions, to be much more appreciative of them. And much more open-minded towards the Buddhism that they're practicing. I think there is a tendency to dismiss the Buddhism of ethnic Buddhists as not, as superstitious.
It's kind of Buddhist in name only, as a family tradition, but it's essentially, it's a label with some cultural practices, but that's not the real Dharma. Is not really happening.
Yeah, and that's wrong. That if it wasn't for that, if it wasn't for those people, there wouldn't have been a Buddhist tradition, that Westerners would have ever.
Right. Where'd all the money for the temples come from?
Oh, yeah, there's that. There's that. We should. I don't want. Yeah, but that's
no.
But
I mean, like the temples are where our revered Buddhist teachers came from, and so
Right.
and but the material basis to be a Marxist, the material basis for those teachings is, people basically just working and going to temple, either regularly time to time and giving money. Being told, well, you give money, you gain merit. And so it's like, well, I don't have any time. Just like they're paper members, right? Just like us in TSA, right? It's like, well, I don't have the time to go and, meditate all day, but I can give some money and, try to learn something.
but at the same time, the door has always been open to those people, and many people have gone through it to take their practice much more seriously. And
Right.
so,
Sure.
I mean, it definitely is true in Zen, but it's not just in Zen. Many of those people who are, good lay people who are good Buddhists who go to the temple, who volunteer or whatever, many of them are also very serious practitioners, very serious students of the Dharma, even though they're also, doctors and lawyers and, Uber drivers or whatever. Um, uh, just because they're not monks or priests, many of them are just like us. That's what I'm trying to say.
So do you think in that sense, the together action for us going forward, if, we're in a post-monastic Buddhism, if we can say that now, is the together action is really just what you do on a daily basis with your Buddhism, kind of like the Upasaka Sutra. The Upasaka Precept Sutra talks about basically works as the way for lay people to become enlightened, right?
Oh.
That all this other stuff.
Yes. Well, so
maybe doesn't matter so much, but really doing good works is how you learn to see the absolute truth.
Or what, so what this is also what Sri Aurobindo called karma yoga. Just to further derail the conversation, bring in Sri Aurobindo and Hindu teachings, but Sri Aurobindo was a revolutionary in India, working against British imperialism, working for the independence of India, not a follower of pacifism by any means. He was involved in a cell of people who were carrying out terrorist actions against the colonial government, and he was arrested and thrown in jail. He had a religious conversion experience. I mean, he was already a Hindu, but he came to the realization that the Indian people had been spiritually colonized, and that became his focus for the rest of his life. And but for as long as India remained, and so he talked about karma yoga. He talked about taking the teachings of Hinduism as he understood them and putting them into practice in people's lives as a form of spiritual resistance to the spiritual colonization of India by the West. Although and he was Western educated. He spent between the ages of 7 and 21, he lived in England. He learned Greek and Latin, studied Plato and Virgil and the original, and so he was kind of the worst case scenario for the West, because he knew us. He knew the British imperialists literally from inside out. But he preached what he called karma yoga in action. In people's daily lives. But the funny part of it is that the British imperialists, the colonial police, who watched him for the rest of his life, they were always certain that this was just a code word. Karma yoga was just code word for planning the next bombing, which in his case it was not. But if you even if you are a monk, even if you are a Zen master, you still have to, walk the walk in your daily life. Even if you're a hermit living in a cave, the Dharma has to be how you live it. And so I doubt that many people who ever hear this podcast are hermits living in a cave, much less monks or nuns. But we shouldn't think that there's anything new or special in that. That is just the way it is for everybody, that we have to find the Dharma in our day-to-day life, every day, getting up, brushing our teeth, going to work, retiring from work, which I've now done, going to school, whatever, raising kids, doing acupuncture, whatever it is that you're doing, that's your practice. And that's nothing new. It's not some great realization that Western Buddhists have just figured out. It's what Buddhists have always been doing. Well, to the best of our abilities, always been trying to do or aspiring to do.
I the only reason I keep on harping on this is, partially because I'm a Marxist, partially because I've had this experience of being together and doing things with other people, like living in Zen centers, and then also on retreat. And that feeling of feeling like you're together with people, you belong, but also that, together you can do something great. And this melding that happens that, we don't really get in our society anymore, except out of maybe going to a sports, or concert, like going to a concert or going to, some kind of, going to a football game or something, where you become one with the crowd and feel this feeling of coming together with people, this idea of solidarity, right? Then when people, that there's a phase shift, right? That there's it's like, emergent property that happens when we're working together. It's kind of like, 100 people each individually, holding a gun and trying to, win a war is going to be different than an army that's trained and working together, right? It's going to be it's like one organism does a different thing. Yeah. And, I just wonder, given the possibility that, attaining enlightenment, if there's no people left because of, climate change and, thermonuclear apocalypse or what have you. I mean, notwithstanding asteroids, et cetera, stuff that's going to happen eventually that could wipe us out. But this sort of, man-made, human-made, cutting short of the ability of future people to become enlightened, which is, as Buddhists, we're like, that's the goal, right? We all want to escape the wheel of samsara. As many people need to get enlightened as possible. That's why we spread the Dharma. That's why we, resisting the urge towards extinction through, consuming everything and turning everything into value that goes into somebody's bank account that they never even use. All this stuff that comes out of, the direction that capitalism is taking us, do you think there's a place for solidarity, or that we need to, as Buddhists, create new structures that create this kind of phase shift, or this emergent property that, all of us individually doing stuff in our own lives, which is, of course, that's wonderful, and that's what you should do. But if we're going to avert, take ourselves away from the cliff, is there something else that we should be doing as Buddhists, say, some other structure that can help us to do something more, or is that just a fool's errand, and that's just what you do with other people if you want to do it?
Well, so I don't think it's a fool's errand for anyone to look into that. But at the same time, I think if humanity is relying on the minuscule number of Buddhists in the West, then we are genuinely doomed. Yes, we are doomed. So we shouldn't. But so it won't come from Buddhists as Buddhists. It can come from. It'll come from those who are trying. It'll come from those who are trying to work it out, and at the same time,
and probably those who have the most at stake, because at the end of the day, that's when you sacrifice. When you have nothing left to lose.
Yeah, and so I think we shouldn't get well. At the same time, I think we should have a very humble attitude towards the Dharma, and especially towards the Dharma as it exists today among Asian Buddhists, and as it has existed in the recent history and throughout the history of Buddhism in Asia. So we should look to that. We should realize that they have been looking at this very question for quite some time, and we can learn from them. One thing we will learn from them is that they haven't figured it out either, though. So, but there's something to be learned from that as well. I mean, all the people who were excited about Kropotkin in East Asia, we're in for a very a rude awakening when World War I broke out and Kropotkin became a Russian nationalist. Uh, I mean, and that was a route that it wasn't just the the change. You know, it wasn't just Kropotkin's support for Russia in World War One. There was a rude awakening. The fact that the West, this place that they were looking to as a source of ideas of egalitarianism and democracy and modernization and a better and freer society, that these Westerners hadn't figured it out. You know, they still had the same sort of conflicts, the same sort of bad motivations that held down Asian society at the same time. So they had their own rude awakening, just like the people who walk into the Tibetan restaurant and see the picture of Steven Seagal on the wall, or whatever. When people are confronted with some of the aspects of Buddhism that don't fit in with their idea of what they think the Dharma should be, there's rude awakenings to go around for everyone. But yeah. I think I've gotten way off track here in this answer, but
I mean, you don't think there's a necessity to create some sort of post-monastic way of being together?
Well, I think that
would do what monasticism did, because monasticism came together because individuals practicing on their own was not seen as sufficient, right? At least to some Buddhists. So this, from the very beginning, there was, groups of people being together and doing this, and just, or is it just that we need to become trad and become monastics again?
Yeah. So I definitely don't think that we need to become monastics. And however, so for anyone who has that as a very genuine aspiration, they deserve all the support in the world. No one should try to talk them out of it. Well, unless it's clear they really don't have no idea what they're getting themselves into. But that's always the case anyway. But I mean,
right,
for the most part, people who want to pursue that, there are Westerners who still pursue that. God's blessed them, But
right. Yeah.
and yeah, I'm not 100% convinced that we are in that Buddhism has to enter into a post-monastic phase. But I am personally not in my own practice or in the kind of practice that I'm interested in doing together with other people, encouraging in others. I'm not interested in monasticism. Mm-hmm. I am very much interested in the kind of practice that people can do and then go home, and continue on their practice when they go home.
Do you think we need to make Zen more churchy then? Kind of do like, more like Pure Land, make it sort of like a place for regular people to come and do a Sunday sit and mm-hmm. have like a, tea afterwards and, have our own, church actions that we do and all that sort of stuff.
I think that if you have a critical mass of people who can come together and do that, that's definitely a wonderful kind of together action. I do think that we should I do think that we should look at practices that are more ceremonial, more ritual, that are potentially more inclusive to people. Traditionally, in this is very much the case in Korean Buddhism, but in Buddhism generally, the practice of silent sitting meditation is often seen as more difficult, whereas there's the practices of not just of sutra recitation, chanting, whatever, and also engaging in ceremonies and rituals is easier. It's actually easier for anybody. It's easier for me. And I think we shouldn't hold ourselves above that. And I think that we should, any time that there is a dichotomy between practices that are like low class and easy and for the masses, and practices that are more, you know, more advanced, more difficult, and only for the select few. Um, Anybody who thinks that they're in that latter category probably it has a problem.
Mm.
I think people should go for the easy practices. I think people should go for the practices that anybody can do, which to a great extent does include meditation. Meditation is, um, uh, well, yeah. I mean, anybody can do it, but I think it should be part of. I think there should be, and this is part of. And this is actually more concrete form of what I was talking about before, about having a more humble attitude towards traditional Buddhism, for
Mm-hmm.
lack of a better term, is to
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of people already do this, but to include more um, ritual ceremony, chanting. I'm big on chanting. Zen Master Sung San was very, very, very big on chanting, and this was kind of this was a very great gift that Zen Master Sung San had for Westerners, to have a practice that, while it included a very significant focus on um, sitting silent sitting meditation, also valued other practices, especially chanting and bowing, which are often seen even in Korean Buddhism as lower class, easier practices for the masses that anybody could do. You can come into the temple in the morning, do some bows, say some Namu Amida Bulls, and then go to work, and that's considered, not nearly as advanced as, doing silent sitting meditation. But Zen Master Sung San put those kinds of practices on more of an equal footing,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is a good idea, and I think is a finger pointing in the, not necessarily to the moon, but in the right direction. That we should
Mm-hmm.
be looking at more at a practice that's more inclusive and easy. Although in practice, a lot of times when used, and I found this, and many people find this, the practice of chanting is not necessarily more inclusive. A lot of people don't like chanting. A lot of people prefer silent sitting meditation. One of the,
Especially our chanting, sometimes
well,
it's pretty weird sounding to, it's not,
no, but
they aren't catchy ditties.
they're extremely catchy ditties. But so one of the reasons why chanting can be a bit of an issue for people is precisely because it does have a stronger aspect of together action in it.
Yeah.
Sitting
Yep.
meditation, everybody can be off in their own little world, um, which is not what's supposed to happen in sitting meditation. But there's little to really check that. Whereas in chanting, everybody has to be chanting the same thing. Everybody has to be listening to each other. It's a much more, um, yeah. So part of the reason why people get turned off by it is because it seems much more religious, which it is. Another reason is because it sounds weird, which it does. And another reason is because uh, you have to pull yourself out of yourself and act together with
Mm-hmm.
others in a way that's much more tangible and in your face
Mm-hmm.
than if everybody can
Mm-hmm.
just sit there quietly, doing whatever it is that they're doing while they're sitting there
Right.
quietly.
And I guess this leads to my one last question that I had, actually leads into it
Hmm.
nicely, which is, um, you know, given the attention economy and phones and just the destruction of our ability to concentrate, plus, you add in, psychotropic medications, and they can have all sorts of effects on what our brains do. And I know for me personally, being on an antidepressant, the good thing about it is it you don't feel terrible all the time.
Hmm.
Bad thing is it alters the way that my brain works so that
Hmm.
it actually can be harder for me to concentrate. And so, I wonder, like, the hole that we're going down, with just the harvesting of our attention and the destruction of it.
Hmm.
Do you think that the ability to even pursue or get enlightenment is getting harder and harder, that we just don't even have the mental power at a decreasing rate to do it. And so maybe something like chanting, maybe together action, giving up on the idea of enlightenment as Buddhists might be what we need to do. That this idea of sitting alone or sitting for years and years and years until your mind breaks open. That's essentially it's a luxury product that almost no one will be able to afford.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I mean, Zen Master Seung San, my teacher's teacher. You're
mm-hmm. My teacher's teacher.
You're a teacher's teacher. He attained enlightenment through chanting, and for the rest of his life, so one of the reasons why, every Zen or other Buddhist teacher who's come to the West has had to figure out what is the balance between what Westerners can handle and what is the tradition that they have to pass on, and in Zen Master Seung San's particular case, he, I think to his credit, he stayed true to his own personal experience, which was that chanting in and of itself is a very powerful practice that in his case, it did lead to his enlightenment. That there, there is, and that's not the generally accepted view in Korean Buddhism. The generally accepted view in Korean Buddhism is that sitting is the highest practice. Chanting is a second-rate practice, primarily for the benefit of lay people and others who can't engage in a lot of silent sitting meditation. So even from his own tradition's perspective, Zen Master Seung San, well, not everybody in the Korean Buddhism. If we go back to Sosan Taesa, again, the guy who organized the Buddhist guerrilla resistance movement against the Japanese invasion in 1592, Sosan Taesa taught that there are three gates. There's the Zen gate, there's the Sutra gate, and there's the chanting gate. And so there's been a great deal of tension before and after that among people who push back and say, so some people say, pick one of those gates as the gate that they think is the best gate, or the gate that they think is the only gate. So there've always been proponents of, the only way to really understand Buddhism is to just devote yourself to studying the sutras, studying the philosophy and the teachings of Buddhism. There have always been people, this is not so much the case in Korea, and it's very much the case in Japan, but there are people who say that the only way to only hope that we human beings have is to just chant. Especially, and this is especially true for people who are devotees of chanting to Amitabha or Namu Amida Bull, and then of course there's always people who say,
like Tina Turner, right, doing the Nembutsu.
Yeah, Nembutsu, whatever, the practice. And anyway, but and then there are people who say no, the royal highway to enlightenment is Zen, in particular silent sitting meditation. But to this day, there's still a lot of tension among people who prefer one way or another, or who, and even to the extent of people who say, okay, there's three gates, but you have to pick one. Zen Master Seung San didn't pick one. He tried to have it both ways, or all three ways. He never was that strong on promoting the study of the sutras, although I think that was still part of his teaching. I mean, that was part of his training. It was part of his experience, as part of his background as a Buddhist monk and priest. But it wasn't something that he emphasized strongly with his non-Korean students. But anyway, I think that we should have it all. We should have it all three ways as well in the West, and that's kind of a way forward for us.
It might be
I
a
mean,
way out of this whole mindfulness becoming an app kind of thing. Is that what, is something that somebody does individually on their own, and in isolation is,
mhm. Oh, well,
you can't chant that way.
so
I
actually,
mean, I guess
though,
you can, but
you can, and in Korea, um, there's a very popular. There are not that many books in this, but it's kind of a genre of chanting books. Chanting books are very popular in Korean. People buy them. You can get them for like $2.50 online. If you know Korean, and if you have like a a checking account that you can buy stuff from Korea through online or some sort of online. I've looked into it a little bit. I'm not sure how to do it. I don't know Korean, so I don't want to click on anything. But you can buy chanting books, and the Korean titles of these chanting books are um, basically something like daily Buddhist practices that you can do even on your own. So these are like for people to do, people
hmm
who sit at home.
hmm
I mean, these are people who almost certainly also go to temples or have some sort of a group that they belong to. But as their regular daily practice, they will chant the Thousand Hands and Eye Sutra
hmm
and do a bunch of Kwanzaa Bosal chanting, and probably recite the Heart Sutra, and they don't have to chant the Great Dharani separately because that's embedded within the Thousand Hands and Eye Sutra. And anyway, so just that is a practice that you can do on your own, and it's a wonder.
Okay.
I do it on my own, um, and of course, in all likelihood, when you're doing a practice like that, you're sitting, you know, you're sitting in meditation posture. At least, ideally, you should be. So it's not like you're choosing between one or the other. Um, it's a way of sitting, I guess. I don't know. I think I've strayed a little bit from what you were asking about.
Yeah,
Not
I
too much.
mean, you don't think that there is necessarily a need for us to be getting together to chant?
Oh no, I do. I mean, so yeah, as long as we're having it both ways or all three ways, let's have it every way. You know, I think whenever people can, they should get together to sit and to chant.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a wonderful practice. I used to be. I used to think that was the only way to do any kind of practice, other than completely on your own. Virtual practice is good. Um, and in many ways, it's not as good as practicing together in physical space. But at the same time, for people who are not close together, it's sometimes it can be the only way that they can practice together. Um, I mean, and in Asia, people have always veiled themselves of whatever was there. Sometimes we have a, a too limited view of how people have practiced the Dharma historically in Asia. There's always been a tremendous spiritual marketplace available to people in Asia, even before the internet. Even before cars and highways and things, you would always have lots of opportunities to avail yourself of different practices, different teachers, different teachings, often under the same roof. In Korea, Zen has historically not been a separate, institutionally separate thing. Zen has always been something that was taught under the same roof as all other aspects of Buddhism. Um, and some people would be interested in Zen, some wouldn't, some wouldn't. But yeah, I think that coming together is good, and availing ourselves of different ways of practicing, different places, opportunities, is what people have always done, and it's what human beings naturally do. People like to check things out, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's good to find something that you find especially uh, uh, conducive to you, but you have to be careful with that, because anything that is too uh, uh, appealing to you is probably just reinforcing where you already are and isn't helping you to get somewhere else. Which, unless you're already enlightened, uh, you don't want to get stuck where you are. You don't just want to get a spiritual practice that validates all of your delusions. or do you? I mean, actually you do. That's part of the problem.
Right.
So
Yeah.
we love validation. I mean, what do we want from spiritual practice? We want, validation and maybe back rubs. I don't know, but yeah.
Well, so and I guess here's an opportunity for you to plug anything you want to plug, whether resources or if somebody wants to find a group to practice with, what should they do if they're, I mean,
yeah.
Or if you want to plug anything, or if you have any kinds of places where you think people should start.
Well, I think my teacher's center, Furnace Mountain. If you Google Furnace Mountain Zen, you will find either. So if you make sure to include the Zen in the group in the search, you will find my teacher's center in Kentucky, Zen Master Daigak Center. If you don't include Zen, then you will find a bluegrass band named Furnace Mountain. Well, if you don't include the Zen, you'll find both. And right. I'm not familiar with that bluegrass band, other than I know that they have the name Furnace Mountain. But they're probably both very good. But I would especially encourage people to check out the Furnace Mountain Zen Center in Kentucky, and which has affiliated groups around the country, most of which also have virtual offerings that people from anywhere that you have an internet connection can participate in. And I myself, through the Rockville Zen group, offer virtual practice opportunities on Wednesday evenings and Saturday mornings, and also I'm teaching classes online on Tuesday evenings. And you can find that information again through the Furnace Mountain website, furnacemountainzen.org, and also if you go to my YouTube channel is the best place to find stuff on what I'm up to in terms of the classes that I teach on Tuesday nights, which is youtube.com /@mindisbuddha, or go to mindisbuddha.org, which is a blog that I have that's not it's a blog that is just a brain dump of things that with a lot of Chinese stuff in it, but it also has links to the classes that I teach in my YouTube channel.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Zen Master Curt, for talking to me.
Yeah.
And it's been wonderful to reconnect, as many people have probably Zoom practice kind of took off during COVID, and so it's been wonderful to reconnect with you after almost 30 years.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I'm glad you're doing this podcast, and I look forward to hearing all the other people that you'll interview. Maybe we can continue talking about Marxism and Buddhism. I have to find out if you're a Marxist or you're a Kautskyite.
I would consider. I'd consider myself a Marxist, and in that vein, I tend to call myself a socialist because, for Marx, communism, socialism are kind of the same.
Yeah.
I think, I'm down for whatever empowers people and gets the most people out of abject poverty and misery. So whatever technology we've got, I'm for it.
Good. I mean, I've got nothing terrible against Kautskyites. I'd just like to know, who that's where they're coming from. But anyway, and Karl Kautsky was like one of the main people that Lenin was arguing against when he said, "No, we must have the revolution now with people as they are now." So Kautsky had something going for him. Anyway, I don't know why I'm dragging Kautsky.
Well, we can go over Bolsheviks and Mensheviks and orthodox Marxism versus vulgar Marxism. We'll go into all of it. Maybe that'll be the next podcast.
Nestor Makhno. We should talk about Nestor Makhno, the great Ukrainian anarchist. Next time. Great. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Curt. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Liminauts. All plugs and links mentioned in this episode will be in the show notes. Tune in next time.